Hello everybody, what is up? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Meredith, thank you so much for being here. If you're a subscriber, you might have immediately noticed that we're not in our usual set. As you guys may know, sometimes when I travel, I like to read a book that takes place in the location of where we're going to make it a little bit thematic, make it a little bit fun. And this week we are going to be covering the Scorch Trials, which is the second book in the Maze Runner series. And a lot of it takes place in the desert. Very differently described desert in the book than what they show in the movie. The book is very much sand dunes, like no vegetation whatsoever. In the movie, they clearly shot, I think, in SoCal, and it looks very similar to this because this is usually what the desert actually looks like. There is vegetation, it's just not trees. In fact, I wanted to angle myself so that you could see that beautiful saguaro there because that's what we're known for here in Arizona. Oh, actually, yeah, let me explain. I was born and raised here in Phoenix, Arizona, and we have these beautiful mountain preserves just around the city. This is always tourists' favorite part. Here, I'll show you where the house line is compared to where I am. Crazy, right? So you can just come out here and hike if you want. Stay on the trail though. Do as I say, not as I do. Anyway, that right there is what we call a saguaro cactus. And they are the pride and joy of the state of Arizona because they only grow in the Sonoran Desert, which basically covers almost exactly the state of Arizona, bleeds a little bit into California, Mexico, and New Mexico, but not by much. They're very protected. If you ever travel here, you do not want to harm one of those. And not only that, but they are deceptively sturdy. They don't look it, but those are heavier than trees. They're full of water. So if you hit it with your car would lose. But anyways, I thought since I lived in a scorched land, and we're talking about a book called The Scorch Trials that takes place in a desert-ish, that we could do some scenic yapping. Shade is very hard to come by out here though, so you'll forgive me for kind of having the tree leaves and branches across my face. There's really nowhere where I could find an even shadow, and I'm honestly probably gonna lose this shade pretty soon. Sun's getting pretty high in the sky. So let's just get going. Let's start talking about the Scorch Trials, shall we? The Scorch Trials is the second book in the Maze Runner series. I read the first book last week. I wasn't planning on doing the second one this soon, but I was really curious about it and you guys loved that video. So I thought, why not? Let's just do it back to back. If you didn't watch my Maze Runner video, I suggest that you go back and watch it, but I'll just give you the overview that enjoyed my read. I found it fun. I found myself hooked, but I had a lot of issues with the book specifically to do with the premise and how it didn't really feel like it made a ton of sense. The premise of the first book is that there is this area that they call the Glade that's in the middle of a maze. Our main character, Thomas, wakes up in this box. He has no idea how he got there. And the box opens and he finds himself in the Glade. He has no memory of who he was before it. And he meets a bunch of boys who were put in a very similar situation to him. They arrived one by one. I did have somebody comment asking about the timing of there being about 50 boys in the Glade. They say one is dropped off every month, but then they say they've only been there 2 years, which would mean there would only be 24 boys. I clocked that too when I was reading it. So in the movie, I think they frame it that Albie was dropped off alone and that he was alone in the Glade by himself. And so I think it makes less sense in the movie, but in the book, they do canonically drop off a big group of boys first, and then they start dropping off one at a time from there. So that's how they ended up with only being there 2 years, but having 50 boys in the Glade. But anyway, all of that to say that none of them have any memory of their life before the maze, but they've built a society there, and there's this maze with these monsters called the Grievers in it. The only way out is through the maze, and they know they have to get through the maze to get out, but there's no visible exit. And so they run the maze every day, trying to see if anything changes. The maze does change daily a little bit, but in a repetitive pattern, and it doesn't really seem to show any signs of breaking that pattern until Thomas arrives. The day after him, a girl arrives named Teresa. She's in a coma for the majority of the book. And then through them remembering stuff from their old life, they're able to crack the code from the maze, which was one of my big complaints about that first book. I didn't really feel like they figured out the mystery as much as they remembered the mystery, which was kind of annoying. I wanted to see them deduce the solution. But all of that to say that they end up figuring it out eventually and they get out of the maze. And in the book, they are rescued by a rebel group who hates Wicked, which is the group that put them into the maze. But it's revealed in an epilogue that that rebel group isn't real and it is just Wicked themselves, kind of staging this because they know that the boys aren't probably going to want to be too helpful to the people who put them in the maze because it was kind of a horrible experience for all of them. So they're rescued by these people, but it's not actually a rescue. And we're left on this cliffhanger of it's time to start phase 2. And the boys are told that they need to travel across the Scorch because there's a cure on the other side of what they call the scorch. So what is the scorch? I'm so glad you asked. Well, apparently some solar flares destroyed the ecosystem specifically around the equator, and it destroyed all vegetation, all plant life, all animal life. So they call this area the scorch, and it's borderline unlivable, is what we're told. In book 2, the boys have to cross the scorch. That's why it's called the Scorch Trials, and that's why we're in my own scorched lands where I live. And for some reason, that destroyed vegetation allowed for some kind of disease that they call the flare to travel more easily. So there are solar flares, and then there's the flare. They're different things. The flare is a disease that people can have that really affects their brain and essentially turns you into a zombie, and then you eventually die from it, and there isn't a cure. And so in the book, the boys are just told at the end of book 1 that they're going to help the rebel group go find the cure, which is in the Andes region, but that means they have to cross the scorch. However, this is when we're going to start talking about the plot of the book, The Scorch Trials, so we're going to get into book 2. Full spoilers. That immediately gets dumped. That is actually not the premise of book 2 at all, in a way that I'm truly actually shocked the publisher agreed to. Because the setup that we had at the end of book 1 was that this rebel group had told the boys that there was a cure in the Andes, and that they had to get to the Andes, but that meant they had to cross the scorch, and they needed the boys to help them do it, and then we find out that it's actually secretly Wicked who's doing that. Immediately at the start of book 2, the boys are woken up the morning after they get to this safe haven from this rebel group to a bunch of confusing things going on. All of the rebels seem to have been killed, and they're hanging from the ceiling by their necks. Teresa is missing, and in her place is a guy named Eris, who tells them that he was in his own version of the maze that only had girls, and he was the only boy, whereas they had a version of the maze that was all boys and they only had one girl, and that was Teresa. So Teresa is missing. They have Eris now. And then a bunch of weird stuff is happening with where they are. The rooms seem to be changing as they're going from room to room in a way that they can't really understand. You know, the dead bodies just disappear. Originally, cranks, which is what they call people who have the flare and have gone crazy, were trying to get in through the windows that were barred, but then those windows were bricked up out of nowhere and things like that, right? They're locked there for 3 days with no food. They do have water. Then they're given food, and a researcher appears with a barrier between him and the boys to tell them that this is still a trial. They are now doing part 2 of the trial, phase 2, and that this involves them crossing an 100-mile stretch of the scorch to get to the safe haven, but that there is another group, Group B, which is the group of girls, and their goal is to kill specifically Thomas. They're all told that they need to go along with it because they've all been given the flare, and that Wicked has a cure, but they'll only give it to them if they actually succeed. And so if they just abandon the trial, then they're going to die of the flare. So the girls need to kill Thomas in order to succeed on their mission, and the boys just need to get to the safe haven successfully. So I think even if Thomas dies, the other boys would have been rescued. But I say all of that to say, that's not what we left it off with at the end of book 1. So it was just really confusing to me because there was a clear setup at the end of book 1 that the boys were going to be tricked into going on this mission, the supposed rebel group, but the rebel group was just Wicked, and that they were going to tell them that the cure was located where they were going. And so they had to go there to get the cure. So clearly, to me, that was the direction he thought he was going to go with book 2. And then you start reading book 2 and that's just completely abandoned. It's never addressed that that's what the boys were told. It's never explained. I guess it's not really a plot hole because, like I said, the boys are told that by the rebels, but then the rebels are killed and Wicked comes back in killed. I don't think they were actually killed. And then Wicked comes back in even though it was just Wicked the whole time. So I'm not saying that there's a plot hole here. I am just saying it's clear that he set up something else and then didn't go with that. And I think that's really interesting because what we ended up with is the most convoluted, ridiculous series of events I've ever read. It doesn't make any sense from front to back. It's all way too convenient. A lot of the complaints that I had about book 1 exist in book 2 tenfold. And I truly actually cannot process, my theory at this point is that he originally planned 2 books and it was going to be The Maze and then whatever happens in that 3rd book, The Death Cure, which I have not read yet. But then the publisher was like, 3 books? 3 books means more money, more book sales. And he was like, okay, I'll write an intermediary book where a bunch happens and yet nothing moves forward. And this is the part where I normally break down the plot of the book, which I almost don't want to do. I almost don't want to do it because it's, again, so ridiculous, so convoluted. and so unnecessary and actually gives us nothing and goes nowhere to a degree that I don't even know how to begin to explain. But alas, that's what these videos usually are. So I am in fact, oh shit. Sorry, I leaned forward to get something out of my pocket and my chair is balanced kind of precariously. It's all good. But that is what these videos usually are. So I am going to tell you about the plot now. So I already covered what happened up until the boys actually start the phase 2 trial. So they start it by basically going through this thing called a flat trans to this completely dark location where they can't see anything. And as they're trying to find their way down this hallway, essentially, one of the boys collapses and Thomas reaches down to find that his head has been replaced with a metal ball. Crazy, weird, what happened there? I don't know, but that boy's dead. I think there's another boy actually that gets got before they get out, and then a third boy named Winston gets attacked by this metal ball thing, but they're at the door now out into the Scorch. So they're able to see it, and they actually are able to pull it off of Winston's head and save him, but he is very injured by this. And then they move out into the Scorch, which, as I've explained, doesn't really seem to look like this type of desert. It seems to be just a flat expanse of land with no vegetation whatsoever and just sand. Like, it's described as completely flat. I understand that we're in a post-apocalyptic world where some environmental things are happening that we don't have in our world, but they do have a massive desert storm at one point as a part of the narrative. And so we find out that winds are blowing, and I do just think it's worth noting, as your resident desert expert, as a girly who grew up in the sand, that if you actually do have a completely flat expanse of land that's just covered in sand like that, then if there is wind, it will form sand dunes. It wouldn't stay completely flat. That's how the dunes get formed. That's not the biggest problem we have with realism in this book, so I'm just gonna move on. Anyway, the boys get out into the actual Scorch. It's very hot, it's very bright. They cover themselves with sheets to avoid getting sunburned, and they see in the distance a city and some mountains. And right away, these people are running towards them from the city, and you guys, I guess I don't know for a fact that my interpretation of where these people came from is correct, but the implication is that the people were running at them from the city, okay? They appear in the desert. They start walking towards the city. These two people start running towards them, and they reach them in a short enough period of time. Within a few hours is the implication. They have a conversation with them that's somewhat ominous and eerie, and then the people turn around and run back towards the city, and then it canonically takes these boys 3 days to reach that city, and they're running some of this time. Truly, how fast were these other people running? Like, if the implication is that they came from the city to talk to the boys and then went back to the city, especially because there's nowhere else those people could have gone, doesn't make any sense. How did they get all the way there and back within a few hours to where the boys couldn't see them anymore because they disappeared back into the city, but then it takes the boys 3 days to reach that location? Even if you were walking a distance that people had been running, that explanation doesn't make any sense. And again, canonically, the boys do run some of this time. And I didn't really talk about this when I talked about the first book. It was kind of a problem with the first book, though, where it doesn't really seem like James Dashner, the author of these books, understands how much time it takes human beings to travel certain distances, and or is willing to kind of throw caution to the wind on the realism of that. Because at points it's remarked that the boys run miles in the maze in a very short span of time. He also says that the runners run essentially a marathon's worth of running a day, which is possible, right? To run a marathon in a day. I mean, people do that when they run marathons. They do it within the day, right? So allegedly, these boys are in shape enough to run a marathon every day. But the boys are always cutting it super close when they come back, when the doors are closing. But then sometimes when they're actually in the maze, they'll cover miles in really short spans of time. It just doesn't really make any sense. Like, how fit are these boys? Can they run like a 6, 7, 8 minute mile super religiously? Could they run an entire marathon at a 10-minute mile? Or does it take them 12 hours to run a marathon, in which case, like, running the shorter spans of miles would take them a lot longer? You see what I'm saying? And I can excuse that. Like, if we're just throwing caution to the wind, he has his own understanding of how quickly people can move and he's going to stick to that, then fine. My issue is how variable it is. Like, how can these two people run all the way to these boys in a matter of seemingly less than a few hours from the city, based off of what's described, and then get back to the city before nightfall, and then it takes the boys 3 days to reach that city? Like, how does that make any sense whatsoever? And not only that, but since I'm talking about this, I'll fast forward a little bit and tell you that at some point the boys also cross a mountain range. Now, this could just be me being picky because, again, I grew up right by the mountains. I've spent my whole entire life hiking mountains. You could never cross a mountain range like what he described in the amount of time that he described. There is truly simply no way. The amount of time it takes them to cross the desert versus the amount of time it takes them to cross that mountain range, it doesn't line up. Just stay consistent with yourself. I can suspend my disbelief about what's normal for humans if you're staying consistent. But if you vary that much, then I'm gonna notice it. But I digress. The boys spend a few days getting to this city, and in this time, there's a little bit of a storm. And by a little bit of a storm, I mean it's a pretty horrific storm, and it happens right before they reach the city, so they are able to run to safety in an abandoned building. Essentially, there's wind, and then there's lightning, and eventually there's rain, but no mention of a dust storm. Again, am I being too picky, you guys? Listen, I'm proud of my home, okay? I know I maybe didn't pick the prettiest. I don't know if it's gonna come across on camera, but I love this ecosystem. I am sorry, but if it was that windy, these boys would not be able to see a goddamn thing. Shit, my phone. Ah! Okay. Me trying to cover for the fact that I just leaned over and fell a little bit, but it's fine. I'm sorry. You guys might end up thinking I'm being overly picky here, but again, I'm from the desert. This storm is very, very windy. And then there's a bunch of lightning strikes, and lightning actually kills one of the boys and injures another one. And then the rain falls, and it's pouring rain. That is all very accurate to how a storm would go. That's what we would call around here. I swear to God, this is the name we use, and I don't know the origin of it, but we do call them haboobs. And they are dust storms that are caused by winds from a thunderstorm. So it's when a thunderstorm starts out over the desert, kicks up a bunch of dirt, the dirt blows into the city, and then the rain comes afterwards. So this is a style of storm that we do have. However, if you've ever been in Phoenix when a dust storm happens, they're kind of like blizzards. I'll put some pictures or some videos on screen. I'm sure I can find some. It's very apocalyptic. Like if you're not expecting it and you've never seen one before, you'd probably think the world was ending, and I'm not even joking. But it's actually fine. It happens at least once a year usually. You can treat them a lot like you would treat a blizzard. If you're driving, you should pull over, put on your low lights. You can't see anything. And that only usually lasts a little bit because then the rain will fall, and that kind of stops the dust storm part, if you will. You're telling me that these boys are in a flat expanse of sand, just completely flat, and they're experiencing like gale force winds canonically, and yet they can see anything. And they're not just like caught up in a dust storm, and they get inside basically right as the rain is falling. Like that does not make any sense. And I'm sorry, I'm just adding it to the list of things in this book that don't make sense. If you're gonna write a book about the desert, even if you're making up your own desert, just do like the tiniest bit of research, man. Our climate is actually quite interesting. Whenever I've talked to tourists and stuff about what the ecosystem and the climate in Arizona can be like, people are fascinated by it because it is very unique. As I've mentioned, the Sonoran Desert basically only exists here, but there are deserts all across the world. There are similar climates to them, but they're very unique to how the climate is not in a desert. And essentially we do get rain, but it's usually bursts of rain that are very heavy, and that's how you end up with cacti. What cacti are essentially like water towers, like natural water towers, for lack of a better way to put it. That's why I told you the saguaro is full of water. So we'll get these crazy rainstorms that only last a little bit, and the ground is really hard, so it doesn't get sucked up into the ground. The cacti suck it up instead, and then they act as a natural water reservoir for most of the wildlife around here. And we haven't seen any of them yet. I thought we'd see at least one. I know I'm right by the houses and it's the middle of the day though. I want you guys to see a roadrunner or something. A roadrunner come out during the day. That's just a tiny gripe. It's not like it matters. Actually, let me correct that. It's not like it matters to anybody but me. So if I'm not mistaken, actually, let me consult my notes. I'm not that worried about getting this exactly correct because, as I've already mentioned a million times, it makes literally no sense. All right, I forgot to mention something. They do stumble across a random abandoned building where they could hear a girl screaming for a while. Just Thomas goes into the building and Teresa is in there, and they have a conversation where Teresa tells him that he has to trust her and that she's like resisting whatever they're putting over her to try and get her to kill him, and like gives him enough time to escape. And so he goes back out, he talks to the other boys, and then they run. And then the lightning storm happens, and then they get to the city and they discover this whole group of cranks, people who have the flare, but they have just been diagnosed and dropped off in the Scorch. And we find out from them that Wicked, which is kind of like the world's government, if you will, at this point, because there are like so many apocalyptic forces that basically all the different governments banded together to try and work together to prevent things from getting worse. That's also not very realistic in my opinion, but you know what, whatever. When people are diagnosed with the flare, they are brought to the Scorch and dropped off because they're trying to stop the spread, and they don't have a cure anyway. And so they basically drop people off in this area for them to slowly die of this disease. And so they run into a group of people who had been freshly dropped off like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And in this group are 2 individuals, Jorge and Brenda. And Jorge has a conversation with Thomas where he ends up deciding to go off alone, him and Brenda, with the boys and abandon the rest of their group. But in the process of doing this, Thomas and Brenda get separated from the rest of the group, and then they have a very forced love triangle sort of situation where Brenda is being very forward with Thomas. It was so obvious to me, like, I don't know, I almost don't want to harp on this for realism because, I'll show my hand here, if you will, and tell you that at the end, it's revealed that a lot of this was plotted and planned by Wicked. And so the implication is that Brenda was in on that as well, and that they were maybe told to act a certain way. We don't have that confirmed. That's what it seems like. And so it's possible that her very forced interest in him was genuinely forced, and that's how it was supposed to come across. But that's where I'm saying, like, the feeling I got right away was that she was essentially told to try and have some kind of romantic thing go on with Thomas because she's just being so forward with him and so on him in a way that doesn't make any sense given the context. And it brings me to something that I, again, didn't really talk about with the first book because I got distracted by a bunch of other things, and it wasn't as bad in that book as it was in this one. But some of you commented about it as well, and I definitely agree that the way that James Dashner portrays women in this series is just interesting. I'm not going to call it terrible. I've certainly read worse. My audio actually might not have been recording through my nice mic for a while. I apologize if the audio's been worse for a bit. I think when I took my spill, it got a little kinked, so it wasn't like quite connected. But anyway, if I had to give it like an overarching point, they're just not really given personalities. Like, Brenda and Teresa don't really have personalities outside of their relationship to Thomas. And there's this entire other group of girls where we only really meet 2 of them, and they don't really have any notable personality traits either. Like I said, with the first book, I kind of ignored it with Teresa because it was just with Teresa, and so I didn't have any other girl characters to compare it to. And also, another thing I didn't mention with the first book that's definitely in there, that's so much worse in the second book as well, is the existence of expendable side boy characters as well. Like, throughout this journey, at least 9 people die from the boy group, and we don't care about any of them. Truly, every single person that dies is somebody that we maybe have been given their name once, but especially at the beginning, both of the boys that die before they leave the tunnel, maybe one of them has a name, I don't know, but I know for at least one of them, Thomas remarks that he doesn't even know that boy's name, and it makes him feel kind of guilty, but he's like, whatever, I mean, he's dead now, and then they move on. And so there's part of me that's like, well, there's a bunch of these expendable girl characters that don't really have any personalities, but there's a bunch of expendable boy characters like that. But I think for me, it's the fact that we don't have a single girl character who doesn't feel like that. Like I said, even Teresa and Brenda don't really have notable personalities outside of what's going on exactly with their relationship to Thomas. They do feel like slightly different people from each other, but it's only, again, in relation to Thomas. Anyway, doesn't matter, tiny gripe. Point is that he and Brenda get split off from the others for a while, and they travel alone, they bond a little bit, but Thomas feels weird over the course of this because he really cares about Teresa. They had a little bit of a love thing going on in the first book, and he's just not really sure how he feels about Brenda. He just met her anyway. They end up seeing a sign on the wall that says, "Thomas, you're the real leader," which reminds me that I completely forgot to tell you that all of the boys, when they woke up at the start of all of this, had tattoos on them that labeled them as part of Group A, and some of them had jobs where Newt's said the glue, because he's like the glue that holds them together, and Minho said the leader, and so everybody kind of defaulted to Minho to be the leader. But then there are these signs all through the city that say, "Thomas, you're the real leader." And we're told by Brenda that these signs exist kind of everywhere. And so the implication is that Wicked didn't know exactly where Thomas would see one of these signs, but they expected him to see one somewhere, right? And that this is part of the experiment. So it says, "Thomas, you're the real leader." And Brenda says that she thinks that these signs are why Jorge agreed to go with the boys when he found out what Thomas's name was, and why there seemed to be such a shift in him when he found out what Thomas's name was, because they figured there must be something special about him because there are all these random signs with his name on them. But they end up getting pulled into this party with a bunch of other cranks where they're forced to drink a liquid that makes them a little bit woozy, a little bit drunky. And then Brenda kisses Thomas, and Thomas says to her, "You're not her, you'll never be her." And he's referring to Teresa, and then they both lose consciousness. And they wake up and they're tied up, and these cranks also want to know what's going on with them because they also know his name is Thomas, and they want to know why there's all these signs around the city that say something about Thomas, right? But then they're rescued by the other Gladers, right? So they finally are reunited with the boys, who come in, save them, and throughout this whole rescue, Thomas gets shot. He gets shot in the shoulder, and then he gets an infection from the bullet wound immediately that infects his whole body. But again, it's like, is that the biggest crime in the realism of this book? And so he is actually rescued by Wicked, and they save him from this infection, and they treat it, and they treat his shoulder, and then they drop him back off. By my calculations, about 2 days later, from like what the boys say back, of like how many days they have left to reach the safe haven. They were given 2 weeks, by the way, to make it across that 100 miles. He ends up getting told right then by the people in Wicked, or he overhears them talking about it, I forget which it is, but that this was not in their variables. So essentially they did not realize that there was a gun in the Scorch anywhere. And so they did not account for the possibility that Thomas got killed by a bullet. And so they rescued him from that because it wasn't part of the experiment. And so Thomas basically tells the rest of the boys, we can die, it seems, because a bunch of boys have died on this journey, but you can only die if you're dying as a result of something that they think could happen during the experiment. If something unexpected happens, such as getting shot from a gun, then they are going to rescue you. But we are also getting flashbacks in Thomas's dreams to memories that are coming back to him of his life before the Glade. And in one of those memories, he overhears somebody talking about how they're not going to let him die specifically because Thomas is their most important candidate. And he gets the word candidate both from that and from the rescue. Like they talk about the candidates and all of that too, and also Thomas being a very important candidate. So in one of his memories, they say something about specifically trying to keep Thomas alive. So it's unclear to me from the reader's perspective if it really is that they would have saved any of the boys or if they just specifically would have saved Thomas because Thomas is really the one that they want, but there's other potential candidates just in case Thomas isn't the right one. And we don't know candidate for what yet. Anyway, the boys are about to leave the city, but I have one other thing to say about their city time, okay? Because they're with Jorge and Brenda are able to share with both groups, like how to get food, how to get water, and all of that, which once again means that James Dashner is not allowing these boys to actually solve any problems for themselves. Like they were not forced to figure out how to feed themselves. They were just fed by Brenda and Jorge. It's just a carryover from the first book. That was something that I complained about, which is supposedly, allegedly, these boys are supposed to be doing these problem solving, but they don't ever do the problem solving. It's always done by somebody else. But anyway, so then they enter the mountain range and Thomas is immediately kidnapped by Group B, which is the girls. And he keeps getting told by them that they were told they have to kill him. He's trying to make all these arguments as to why they shouldn't. And then towards the end of their journey through the mountain range, he's pulled aside by Teresa, who's been really pretending to hate him this whole entire time. And the girls keep warning him that it's like, Teresa really does hate you, man. She hates you for something. And he's like, yeah, whatever, I didn't do anything to her. And at one point she does also pop into his head and tell him to trust her and stuff like that. And so she tries to pull him aside and he ends up going with her. And then Eris is there and they do this whole like, oh, I've actually been in love with Eris this whole time, not in love with you. And they force him into this box. He's like, oh my God, she actually did hate me. She actually was trying to trick me. I guess it was all just pretend. And he feels super betrayed. And then he's sprayed with some gas while he's in the box. And then he wakes up and he's still in the box. And Teresa and Eris open the door and they're like, hey, all of that was fake. We were told by Wicked explicitly that we had to make you feel super betrayed. And so did you feel betrayed? Did it work? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, okay, cool. So all of that was fake. I didn't mean any of it. And he's like, okay, cool. But I like don't trust you now, like at all. She kind of tries to go back to the way things were before, but Thomas is really resistant. And she does eventually tell him that she gets it if they can never go back to the way things were. But if she hadn't done what she had done, then he potentially could have died. Or, you know, she could have died. Eris could have died as well. And so she's like, us all being alive is enough for me. And so if you never forgive me, it is what it is. And then they get to the safe haven and there isn't really anything there, but then these monsters appear and there's a storm. And so some people die in the midst of all of that, but then they get rescued by a helicopter. And at first, the people from Wicked are really upset that Brenda and Jorge are there. And they specifically tell Thomas he has to choose one of them, which is really weird. And so he chooses Brenda because he thinks he's outsmarted them, and he thinks that that means they'll actually sacrifice Jorge, but then they're going to sacrifice Brenda. The boys all attack him being the guy from Wicked, and then he's like, okay, you acted exactly how we thought you would, and like all of this has been super planned out. And there's still like a tiny bit left in the book, but I want to pause here because I've been hinting at, you know, all of these different problems with the realism in this book, but I keep saying that's not the worst part, okay? This is the worst part. It was a stretch for me to believe that they put these boys in the maze to study them and study their behavior, and that they would have gone with something as extensive and resource draining as this maze in a world where resources are so scarce. But you expect me to believe that they just let these boys out in the open, and then they generally played everything out exactly the way Wicked thought that they would. And the only curveball is Thomas getting shot, but Wicked is able to immediately rectify that and get them back on track. That doesn't help, James. It feels like he threw that in there to be like, yeah, of course, because if it was that open-ended, not everything could go exactly the way that this evil villain scientific organization could want it to go. But no, it does actually go exactly the way they want it to go most of the time. And there's like this one time that things go slightly awry, and then they're able to rectify it immediately. That doesn't make any sense. If they were this out in the open and this exposed to how much different things could go wrong, then absolutely it would have gone off the rails. And not only that, but then we get the rest of the book where most of the Gladers are taken to a safe space where they're given like clothes and food and water, and they're told it's all done, it's all over. Except for Thomas. Thomas is kept in his own padded room, and the other Gladers are told that this is because the flare was too deep in him, and so they weren't able to cure him the way they were able to cure everybody else. But we find out from Thomas's perspective that that's not actually why. He's finding this out through mental telepathy with Teresa, by the way, like what the other Gladers are being told and where they are. But he is kept separate, and he knows that it's not really because of the flare stuff. And then we're told in the epilogue that some of these boys are immune to the flare and others of them aren't. All of this actually was in pursuit of a cure, but that they don't have a cure right at this point in time, which meant they lied, right? Then I did read, like at the end of my copy of the book, there was a bonus chapter from the third book, and actually it's chapter 2, which I thought was really interesting because usually it's just chapter 1 that they throw in there, but I almost wonder if they chose chapter 2 specifically because in chapter 2, there is a full conversation between the researcher and Thomas about the fact that he is immune to the flare. They call them Munies, if you will. And outside of Wicked, they hate the Munies because obviously the flare has like really destroyed the earth. And so if you're just immune to it, like people hate you basically. I wonder if they threw that in there because, as I said at the beginning, I almost didn't want to recount all of that to you and talk to you about it because it's so pointless and so stupid. At the end of book 1, we knew that it was an experiment, that they were being studied, and that they were trying to put together a group of boys for a very important mission. Then we know throughout the entirety of book 2 that they're still in the experiment and they're still being studied. And then we find out at the end that it all has actually been because some of them are immune to the flare and others of them aren't. And that this has something to do with them potentially being able to help them find a cure, studying their patterns, blah, blah, blah. Like that is the only reveal that we get in this book. Otherwise, we end it in the exact same place that we started it in, with all of the Gladers in Wicked custody and not knowing anything about exactly why other than that they're there for a cure. So do you see what I'm saying about the whole book essentially being pointless? It's all this plot that doesn't make any sense, and it's just hammered out. It's like thing after thing after thing after thing. Kind of like I talked about with the first book, like there's no showing the camaraderie between the boys. There's no moment where anybody bonds. I guess except for him with Brenda, but like there's very few chill moments. There's very few calm moments. There's very few moments where anything good happens. It's just like thing after horrible thing happening to these boys. It never ends. It's the whole entire book. None of it makes any sense. None of it tracks. And at the end, we basically ended in exactly the same spot we were at the beginning, just with one tidbit more of information. That still doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Like, I got a bunch of comments saying book 1 was okay, but I DNF'd it in book 2, and I completely get why. If I were not reading it for the series, I don't think I would have finished it. I think I would have been like, this is so pointless, and I probably would have just Googled what the ending was and moved on with my life, right? But not only that, I have one other gripe with the realism of all of this, right? Which is that they keep talking about all these variables that that they're putting into play and like the patterns and stuff. And we don't know exactly what they mean yet. And so for all I know, when we get the actual explanation, this will be retconned and it will make sense. But we keep getting told that putting the boys through all of this is vital to their research, to figuring out the cure. And it's because they're studying the boys and their reactions. And yet we are also told that they laid all of this out so perfectly that they knew exactly how it was going to play out, and basically nothing surprised them except for the gun. So why the hell did they need to actually put the boys through the experiment? Like, if you knew exactly how all of it was going to play out, but then you keep saying that you need to get your cure because you need to get the blueprint, you need to get the patterns, like this is what they keep saying. Is it about the boys' reactions to things or not? Because if you can predict that accurately, how they're going to react to things and what they're going to do and what the different variables are going to do to their situation, then why did you need to put them through it in the first place if what you're going for is getting those patterns? That doesn't make any sense either, right? So genuinely nothing about this book makes sense. And it was a really frustrating read, and I gave it a 1 star, which is a very rare for me. For context, I gave the first one 3 stars. I don't think I ended up saying that in my video, but as I said in that video, I had an enjoyment of it, and I don't really know how to explain where that enjoyment came from. It was silly and it was ridiculous, but sometimes a silly and ridiculous read is fun, and I was curious about the maze, and I did want to know like what the solution to the mystery was and all of that, and that did keep me hooked. In this book, I had none of that. I was not really hooked. I did not really care about what happened because I pretty much knew what was going to happen from the jump. I knew that they were going to make it through the trials, and I knew that nobody important to us was going to die. From the beginning of the series, Chuck is the only character that's important to the reader at all that ends up dying. I'll go back to what I said about there being all of these random side character boys that seem to exist only to be expendable, to show how easy it is to die in this environment, except none of the main characters that we care about actually end up dying. And so as a result, it doesn't feel like there are any real stakes. Listen, everybody wants to be George R.R. Martin, okay? Everybody wants to be the cutthroat author that kills off their main characters and all of that, and has a super high intensity series where a bunch of characters die. But if you do not kill characters that you have spent time with, that the reader cares about, then it has no impact. It has no impact on me whatsoever. I was not stressed at any point that anything was going to actually happen to Thomas because he's the main character, and I do have the advanced knowledge of knowing that there is a third book and that it does center around him. But at no point did I think Newt was at risk. At no point did I think Minho was actually at risk. Like any of these characters that we've actually gotten to know over the course of these books, that we've spent time with, that we care about, that Thomas cares about, none of them are ever truly at risk. And the only moment in it that I thought that there was a possibility that a character that we cared about was gonna die was Brenda at the end. But then she doesn't actually die, so it's fine. Yeah, there's no real stakes. Like, if you're not gonna kill characters that I care about, then there's no real stakes because the rest of them are just names on a page. I know this is fiction. I know these aren't actual people dying. And so if you're not showing me that as an author, you're willing to kill off characters that I even know the name of, then why would I be worried about any of the characters that I know the name of? Not to mention they have it happen twice where 2 characters that we actually do know relatively well, Winston and Minho, get very injured by things that kill other boys. Minho almost gets struck by lightning at one point. I don't remember if I said that, but neither of them die from that either. Anyway, all of that to say that I ended up giving the book 1 star, and I truly think I would have DNF'd it if I wasn't making a video series on it. It was just bad, guys. It was just bad. I really don't have that much more to say on it than that. It didn't make any sense. The plot was kind of aimless. Felt like it was just never ending bad shit happening over and over and over again. Oh God, are ants all over my water bottle. Cool. And we almost just tilted forward again. Got to make sure I'm leaning back in my chair. Now we need to talk about the movie, which is wildly different from the book. And I'm about to commit book blasphemy and be honest with you guys and tell you that I think it's way better than the book. I do. I think it's way better. And it actually makes a lot of sense why I got a ton of comments under my first video from people saying that they either never read the books or they tried to read the books and couldn't really get into them, but then they watched the movies and loved them. Or that they went to read the books after watching the movies and didn't like them nearly as much or didn't end up finishing them. And actually, a lot of people told me that they DNF'd it in the middle of book 3 because something happened that really pissed them off. So I'm very, very curious to know what that is. The movie essentially dumps all of this completely out the window and follows an entirely different plot. But in my opinion, is at least a plot that makes a lick of sense and only really has one tiny plot hole. It's a teen dystopian movie. If you go into it with that expectation, I think you'll enjoy yourself. I was watching it at my parents' house, actually. My dad's retired, so he was kind of walking in and out of the room, and he pulled the dad move of like kind of coming in and out and eventually just sitting down on the couch and watching it with me. He gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. So it gets 3 out of 5 dads. And I would give it a 3 stars as well. Like I said, I think if you go into it expecting it to be a teen dystopian movie, you're going to know exactly what you're in for and it's going to be fine. So anyway, let's break down what's different about it, which is basically everything, to be honest. And I'll start by saying that at the end of movie 1, we got a different explanation for why the boys were in the maze. We were told at that point in time that they were in there because they were immune to the flare and that the researchers were studying their brains to figure out a cure. So that is kind of what the reveal in book 2 is. And so that explains where that came from, right? They just told you that at the end of movie 1 instead of during movie 2, I guess. They then do the fake rescue thing as well. And so at the beginning of this movie, they actually stick to that. They stick to them thinking that they're with a rebel group, but it's actually secretly Wicked. And they do eventually discover that it is Wicked. They meet Eris, and Thomas and Eris discover that they had all these other mazes, there's a bunch of other kids there, and they're taking them away in small groups to essentially drain them of something, like there's something that they're draining them of, and so they end up kind of suspended from the ceiling. They don't seem to be dead, but they're being kept unconscious, and they're clearly draining something from them. Because of this, Thomas, Minho, Frypan, Winston, Newt, and Teresa escape. Did I say Eris? Also Eris. Eris is with them. It's revealed pretty early after they escape that Teresa was given her memories back. And so she remembers why they were there. And she tells Thomas that they have to go back. But Thomas doesn't listen to her and he's like, no, this is going to be better for us. Trust me. And they're trying to make it to a rebel group that they've heard of in the mountains called the Right Arm or something like that. And then their journey from Wicked to the Right Arm does actually mirror some of what happens in the book, which I thought was interesting. They ended up loosely following the base plot of the book, but the reason why the group was in the desert was very different. It's because they did discover that they weren't actually with a rebel group and that this group wasn't actually helping them and that it actually was Wicked. And then they're trying to escape Wicked like for real. And that's how they end up in the desert. And then the stuff happens where they find Jorge and Brenda betray the rest of their group to go off with them. And then Brenda and Thomas get separated, and a lot of their journey closely mimics what happens with Thomas and Brenda in the book. So there is a following of the skeleton of the book stuff, but they take out basically all of the things about it that don't make any sense, and they just justify things a lot better and why certain things happened a lot better. And I thought it was just a lot more seamless and a lot more enjoyable, to be honest, in the book. And like I said, there's only really one plot hole that my dad and I, couldn't really resolve for ourselves, but it potentially is going to be explained in movie 3, which is that at some point Brenda and Jorge aren't cranks at this point in time. They don't have the flare, but Brenda gets it at one point when she's with Thomas. She gets bitten. So she's in the early processes of developing the flare, and a researcher that's with the rebel group tells Thomas that he can actually help her, and she takes his blood and she separates out the enzyme or whatever. That's why they want the immunes. And she tells them that it's like in their blood and that they just need to separate it out and that they can then give it to people who have the flare, and it won't cure them, but it will stave off the symptoms for a period of time, and then they'll need more of it. And my dad and I immediately were like, wait a minute. It wasn't clear when the bodies were being suspended that that's what was happening, that they were pulling out their blood and separating something from it. Maybe if I knew more about biology equipment, I would have got that from what they shown us. But we knew they were harvesting something from the immunes, but we didn't know what it was. It's just blood. Humans make more blood. Like in the real world, we have blood banks where people donate blood at intervals. Like, why would they need to do it in this really weird and grotesque way? Why couldn't they just have all of these people live here and tell them that they need their blood for the cure and then have them regularly donate blood and to otherwise take care of them? Like, why would they need to suspend them from the ceiling and harvest the blood from them? The only explanation that I could come up with is that they're just greedy and they want more of it than a human body could give and be fine. And so they need to keep them unconscious so they can take as much blood from them as possible at all points in time. But I just don't understand why they couldn't just have people donate blood. And basically, if you're immune, then you can get taken care of by this Wicked organization and live out your life in some camp of theirs or something in exchange for donating blood at regular intervals. And then they use that to make the cure. Why did they have to go about it in such an inhumane way? And then one might ask, why the fuck did they put them in the maze? And so this brings us back to this question. And so it was weird because I felt like the reasoning they gave at the end of the first movie did justify why they were in the maze a lot more. Because it's like, oh, we're studying your reactions, we're studying your brains, we're trying to see how you react to things. And that's how we're going to find the cure. But then we find out in movie 2 that the cure is actually in their blood. So why on earth did they need to go into the maze? That still doesn't make any sense. So in book 1, the reason why they're in the maze makes no sense. Movie 1 does a better job of justifying the maze in the short term. And then book 2 justifies the maze a little bit better because we find out about them being immune and studying them and all of that. But then movie 2 kind of throws away their justification for the maze by having the cure be in their blood. And the only explanation we get is that they don't actually have a full-on cure. They only have something that staves off the flare. And so the main doctor or whatever keeps saying that she can't lose any of the boys. That's why they go through all the effort to basically hunt down the ones who escape, because they need all of them, because they need their blood, because she just needs more time to actually figure out what the full cure is. But she seems very focused on their blood. Very, very focused on their blood. So why the fuck did they put them in the maze? So I don't know, maybe some information is given to us in movie 3 that retcons that. But here at the end of having seen movie 2, both me and my dad just could not make it make sense to ourselves why they had to suspend all the kids from the ceiling and have them in a coma to get the blood from them, and why they wouldn't just set up a system where you get like food or shelter or to live in one of these camps and be taken care of in exchange for like giving your blood, and then that's the cure. And right as I'm losing my shade from the tree, I can tell you how the second movie actually ends, and then we'll do some final thoughts. So the second movie ends with Teresa betraying the group because she still believes in the greater good and she believes they should go back to Wicked. So they find this rebel group that's about to bring all of the immunes that they have to the safe haven that they built for people who are immune to the flare. They're about to go to the safe haven, but then Teresa betrays them by calling Wicked and telling them where they are because she believes that they need to be a part of the cure or whatever. And she's willing to sacrifice all of them to find the cure. So Wicked shows up and takes her and Minho and everybody else that we don't care about. And everyone that we otherwise do care about doesn't end up getting taken. And so there's a person there who says that they'll still take them to the safe haven, even though there's way less of them now and Wicked got most of them. But Thomas refuses to go without Minho and says he's going to go back for him, and then says, actually, I kind of want to destroy Wicked. And so even if it's kind of a suicide mission, like I want to go destroy Wicked and stop them from being able to do this to anybody else and like stop this evil villainy that they're doing. And everybody else agrees. And so that is the setup for movie 3, it seems, that they are going to band together to try and take down Wicked. So at the end of book 2, we have Thomas being kept separate from the rest of the group. We don't know why they're trying to collect these patterns or how this helps them find a cure, but we do know that they don't have a cure right now. In the movie, they have a way to stave off the flare using the immune's blood, but they don't have a full cure. And it seems that the premise of the third movie is that they're going to try and take Wicked down, and we'll see where that goes. I also have since found out, I thought it was a 4-book series with a prequel, but it turns out that it's a 3-book series with 2 prequels. And I've heard from people that the prequels actually make some of the explanations worse, like that he tries to retcon stuff, but it actually ends up making less sense. So I'm very curious about that as well. I'm really curious about both book 3 and movie 3. Despite myself, I am kind of curious for what the explanation is going to be as to why they need these patterns. I'm curious to see how he tries to explain all of this. And I'm excited to be angry about it because based off of what you guys have hinted at in the comments under my first video, it doesn't really seem like I'm going to think it's a good explanation. And I'm curious to see what they do with the movie and if I end up liking the third movie way more than I like the third book. So I'm curious to see if they're able to end the movie series in a way that like makes sense and makes me feel satisfied and at least keeps it at a 3-star, because I got the movie series at like a 3-star right now and I've got the book series at like a 1 out of 5. Or I guess I should give it a 2 since I gave the first one a 3. So split the middle. I've got the book series at a 2 right now. All of that to say, have you guys read this? What did you think? Did you enjoy today's episode of Scenic Yapping? I got quite a few comments from people under my first video saying that they never actually finished the series because they got so angry at book 3. And so they're excited for me to make the third video because they want to know how it ends, because something big happens that apparently pisses readers off. So I don't know. I'm very curious about it. We'll find out what it is for me relatively soon, because like I said, I'm curious, so I might crack into the book tonight now that I filmed this. I just didn't want to bias myself because I figured information was going to be revealed, and so I thought that this might not be the most honest review of book 2. It might change some of the way I talked about it if there's information revealed in book 3 that I don't have right now. So anyway, all of that to say that I've somehow managed to time that perfectly, and I just lost my shade like 10 minutes ago. All right, I love you guys. I'm gonna pack up and head back to my car. Let me know what you think of all of this in the comments down below. And oh my God, I have completely forgot in the last video. Okay, I'm gonna keep the survey open one more week, but I've only talked about it in my Animal Farm video, but I wanna do some kind of special bonus for 50K subscribers, which I'm about to hit. I'm really close. And so thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it, but I'm gonna link the survey for you guys to make suggestions for potential videos. It will ask for you to sign in, but it's not collecting emails. I just wanted to stop people from spamming the form. But if you have multiple suggestions, you can just include them in one submission of the form, and I'll pick one idea from there to do for a little bonus video once we hit 50K, which I think will be really fun. I love you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!